Hello, everyone. Welcome to your course, Deep Learning for AI, Aesthetics and Creativity. This session, we have two special speakers. First, we start with Professor Devi Parikh. She is an associate professor in the School of Interactive Computing at Georgia Tech and also a research scientist at Facebook. I let the speaker themselves introduce themselves a little more, and tell you a little about their background. But I think that what Professor Devi Parikh is doing is very interesting in terms of really trying to go out of the distribution of the data and explore applications of AI in creativity. So please start your.
Thank you. Thanks, Ali, for the invitation and for the introduction. So you asked me to say a little bit about how I got interested in this space.
Yes.
And to be honest, I think I don't have a particularly good sense for how I sort of arrived in this space. In general, I tend to work on things that I find interesting and exciting. And this just kind of piqued my curiosity. And I was curious to see in what way can AI help humans be more creative, either through the final artifact that's being created being more interesting, more satisfying, or even if the final artifact isn't better, just sort of the creative process being more engaging for a human, more satisfying. Maybe one common theme that my work has tended to have over the years is this interest in human machine collaboration, interaction. So sort of humans have been on my mind a bit whenever we are trying to develop AI. And so I think that is maybe one thread that some of my other work is in vision and language. And there I got, my background is in computer vision, but I got interested in language because it provides this nice modality for humans to use it as a mode of communication and interact with machines. So that is maybe one common thread that I think survives here as well. Um, yeah, and so I think with that I'll switch over to my slides. I do want to say that I would much rather this be an interactive session, and so anytime there are questions or anything like that, feel free to just unmute yourself and just ask away, and I don't have to get through all my slides, so that's not an issue. So this is just, as the title suggests, this is just going to be sort of a bag of um, explorations like talk. There's a few different things we've explored in this space, and so I just want to tell you a little bit about it. And as I already said, please feel free to interrupt with questions, thoughts, comments, anything like that at any point. Um, so one question, and maybe this audience, maybe it's a little bit preaching to the choir, but it's often sort of in core AI, you often get the question that why is it interesting to study creativity? And I think there's a few reasons for that. One is it poses new AI challenges, right? In the sense of when you're trying to produce something creative, by definition, you kind of want something that is in some sense out of distribution from the things that you've already seen. And so it has this, at the core of it, there is this notion of generalization that you need to think about. Another challenge tends to be that there aren't well-defined evaluation metrics for many of the things we try and do in this space, especially because creativity is often subjective, and there isn't even sort of from a more philosophical perspective, there often isn't an agreement on how creativity is even defined, leave alone trying to quantify it with evaluation metrics. And so I find that challenge to be quite interesting to think about how you can evaluate when you're working in this space. And as I said in the introduction, I think human AI collaboration tends to be at the center of this, tends to be at the core of this. And that again presents a new set of challenges that might not be there if you're just sort of thinking of autonomous entities. In terms of, so that's what makes it interesting, right? This is why it's interesting to study it from the perspective of an AI researcher. The other question could be, well, it might be interesting, but why is it useful? And there, I think it's sort of expressing ourselves creatively is a deeply human experience. And so if we have tools that make it more effective for people to be able to express themselves creatively, I think that's going to be very useful. I think that would be well adopted. And finally, I think from more sort of a higher level perspective, creativity is at the core of all progress we make, whether it's scientific progress or sort of in the arts. And so if we can use technology to enhance human creativity, that feels like a fairly powerful use, hopefully a good use of technology. All right, and so with that, I'm just going to dive right in. These are sort of screenshots of the 6 different explorations that I'll be talking about today. And as one final reminder, please do interrupt me with any questions, and I'll also make sure I'll pause every so often to take questions. All right. So let me get started with this first one. This is a project called Creative Sketch Generation, which recently got accepted at iClear, and it was led by Song Wigger, who was an intern with me at Facebook AI Research last summer. And so the idea here was we were interested in studying sketches, we were interested in generating sketches. But when we looked at the kinds of sketch data sets that are out there, at least the ones that we could find, they tend to look like this, right? And so they tend to be these fairly realistic depictions of everyday objects, like in this case, birds. But what we were interested in was more things like this, where we were interested in being able to generate these sort of fantastical depictions of birds and other creatures. And there weren't any existing data sets that we could find that had sketches like this. And so the first thing we did was we collected this data set. And the way we did this was we wanted people to be engaged in a creative exercise when they were drawing these sketches, as opposed to sort of trying to mimic a realistic object from their memory or from another photograph. And so the way we set this up is we gave on an interface like this, we gave subjects a random initial stroke, and then we told them to draw an eye wherever they wanted. And so here the person decided to draw an eye here. And then we asked them to sort of take a step back and think about how this random stroke and how this arbitrary eye can be used in a sketch for a bird or a creature, depending on which data set we were collecting. And so from there, once they figured out what that should look like, they were asked to draw one part at a time, right? And so here, the person is first drawing the head, and then they're drawing the body, and then they're drawing this horn. They decide to undo it and draw it again, and then they go with, I think that was legs or feet, and so on, right? And so we are getting this depiction of, in this case, a sad creature. But the thing to notice is that one, it's a creative exercise because of how it was posed, how it was prompted to figure out how an initial stroke and an eye can be incorporated in a creature. And two, because they're drawing one part at a time, we have these part level annotations for every stroke that was drawn, right? And so that gives us, and so we collected this data set for one for birds and one for creatures in general, that look something like this, like what you see on the screen. We have 10,000 sketches in each of them, and the strokes are annotated with the various body parts that we had in the library, right? So any questions in this so far?
Oh, I'm just curious, how long did it take you to get 10,000 sketches?
So this was on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And if I remember correctly, I think we were doing batches of 1,000 sketches at a time. And I feel like each of those batches was maybe getting done in a couple of days or so. So I would say overall, maybe few weeks to a month. So not, I guess I don't know what your expectations were, but not too terribly long. Um, yeah, I think the challenging part was more figuring out the interface and running the pilots and looking at the kind of data we were getting and tweaking that to make sure we're getting the kind of data we're interested in. But yeah, it wasn't too long overall. Any other questions? All right. And so now that we had this data set, we wanted to work on building a model that can generate these creative sketches. And so what we built was
Sorry, Professor Barry.
yeah.
Someone is asking, Elena is asking, what was the target group? Adults, kids?
It was, so Mechanical Turk, I think, doesn't allow, I think there's like, you need to be at least 18 to be on the platform. So these were all adults. And we also, so one thing I didn't mention is that after they finished the sketch, we also asked them to add a caption to the sketch, just to sort of add to the creativity, where like you're sort of titling the work that you made kind of thing. And that was intended to be in English. And so I'm 90% sure that we restricted this to be people who were in the US. I'd have to go back and double check that, but I think those were the only constraints.
Thank you.
And yeah, that's a good point. I don't think I can see the chats. If there are any questions in chat, thanks, Ellie, for for pulling that out. I won't be able to see it. All right. Yeah, and so we had this part-based GAN model where there were two pieces to it. The first piece was a part selector that, given an incomplete sketch, decides which part should be drawn next. And this is learned from the data set that we have. And then once you figured out which part it wants to draw next, the part generator is the one that generates the part. So it decides what the part should look like and where it should be. And then these can, at inference time, these can work in sync, right? So at inference time, again, you start with a random initial stroke. That's the setup, just like it was given to humans. And then based on that, the part selector will decide which part it wants to draw first, which in this case, the first part will always be the eye, because that's what we told people. We forced them to draw the eye first. And then based on where the eye and this initial stroke is, it decides which part to draw next, and then it draws the part, and that keeps repeating. And so because this is a part-based model, sort of compositionality is somewhat inherent in here, right? Where it can generate different parts. And so as a result, it can generate entire sketches that have the potential to be different from what was seen in the training data set. So this is a visualization of these part-based sketches being created. On the left are the birds, on the right are other creatures. As I'm sure is plenty obvious to you that the birds are looking much more like birds than the creatures are looking like creatures. So this will also pan out in the quantitative evaluation that we do, where this model works much better for birds than it does for creatures. But even for creatures, it does better than some of the strong baselines we compare to. And so as you may have noticed, these generations were at a low resolution. But one interesting thing that we found was that with essentially some image processing techniques, more or less, we could take this low resolution rastered image that has been generated and convert that into vector graphics, which gives us arbitrary resolution, which is great. But more interestingly, actually added a very interesting aesthetic to what these sketches look like. And in our human studies, when we compared this aesthetic of the SVG to the original raster image that was generated, 96% of the time, subjects preferred the aesthetic of this SVG. And so that's something that was an interesting sort of byproduct. We were doing this just for the resolution, but actually the strokes also look kind of interesting in this setting. And so we have a whole bunch of we've used the regular GAN evaluation metrics like the FID scores and all of that. And all of that is in the paper. But I think the human studies are perhaps more telling. And so what you're seeing here is on the left is the creative birds, on the right is the creative creatures data set. On the Y, and what we're doing is a pairwise comparison. So we're showing human subjects a sketch generated by Doodler GAN, which is our approach, and a sketch generated by some baseline that we're comparing against. And we're asking subjects various questions like which one is more creative, and there we're not defining it, we're letting them decide whatever creative means to them. We also ask them which one looks more like a bird, which one do they like better, which one looks like it was more likely to be drawn by a human, and which sketch integrates that initial stroke better in the sketch out of the two sketches that we showed them. And on the Y, so that's what you're seeing on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, you're seeing the percentage of times that Doodler GAN was preferred over the baseline, right? So higher is better for Doodler GAN. And the horizontal dashed borders is the band of statistical significance. So in that band, we wouldn't be, so that's around 50%. And so we can't tell the difference. And so we're comparing to things like Sketch RNN, StyleGAN. We also compare to the actual human-drawn birds from the QuickDraw dataset as an example of sketches that are good in the sense that people created them, but they are realistic. They were not trying to be creative, right? To try and see if we've captured the creativity part. And then this darker gray bar is showing them human sketches from our data set. And so that in some way you can think of as the oracle, if you will. And so what we're seeing is our approach is outperforming many of these settings. What was particularly interesting is that on this bird data set, for a couple of these metrics, people actually prefer Doodler-GAN generated sketches over the ones that were drawn by humans in our data set, which we thought was interesting and not something we were expecting. On the right, with creatures, everything is worse, like we saw even with the qualitative examples. We are still outperforming many of the baselines, but we're doing much worse than, so for example, what the human sketches look like. So I'll pause here to see if there are any questions. No?
Sorry, so here in these plots, which one is Doodler again?
So Doodler-GAN is the one that's being compared. This is a pairwise comparison. And so
Right.
Doodler-GAN is the one being compared to all of these.
Right.
And so this number, for example, is telling you that 80% of the time, Doodler-GAN was preferred over Sketch RNN.
I
So
see.
Doodler-GAN is just across, yeah, it's just everywhere. And the only
That's
thing they're
interesting.
comparing,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's quite high.
Yeah, yeah.
Percentage based, what is percentage based representing?
So percentage based, so the approach that I showed you generated the sketch one part at a time, right? And one question that we had was how important is the fact that these parts are semantic parts? If instead we just took a sketch and just divided it into chunks of the first 20% of strokes, the second 20% of strokes, and we ignored the part annotations, how well would that do? And so that is the percentage based, where it's not a part based model anymore, but it's still being generated one piece at a time just based on different slices of the percentages. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Another interesting thing that we found was that when we were looking at some of the sketches that were generated, we felt like some of them seemed to be depicting combinations of different animals. And of course, we could be overthinking it, we could be hallucinating it because this is very subjective and very qualitative. But here are some examples of that, where this to us felt like was maybe a mix of like a squirrel and a sea turtle. And actually, for some of these, we also ran them through classifiers that were trained on the QuickDraw dataset that has many, many categories. And so we could see that multiple categories were firing in some of these sketches. So that was our way of trying to make this a little bit more objective. But we thought this was kind of interesting. And so our data sets, our code, all of that is available online if anyone's interested in using it. We also have a web demo that I want to show you next that I actually think is quite fun. You can try it out and see what you think. The link is on the top of this page. And you can start with the birds one because that, as you saw in the results, works better than the creatures. And so the way this is set up is you can, it starts with an initial, like a random initial stroke, like we've seen. And then at every stage, you can decide whether you want to let the model draw the next part or whether you want to draw the next part yourself. And in these two cases, which part should be drawn is being decided by the model. So the model thinks the eye should be next, and you can either let the model draw it or you can draw it. Or you can say that you don't want to listen to the model in terms of which part should be drawn and you want to pick your own part. And so here, this is a random initial stroke. This is where the model decides to draw the eye. This is where it decides to draw the head. So I should say that this is, I haven't cherry picked this, so you will see some bad generations and then hopefully you will also see some good ones. But so this is where now the model is drawing the beak, which doesn't look very good. And so you can undo that and you can say that you're going to draw the beak yourself. And so this is this is me drawing the beak. And then the model decides that the body should be next. You let the model draw that. You let the model draw the wings. It's not really looking very good, but you decide to go for it. And those are the legs. And so that's what the sketch looks like. We can start over again, another stroke. This is where the model draws the eye, the beak. It's not making, then the head, and then the beak kind of makes sense in the context. The legs, I think the wings were before. That's the wings. And the tail, and then the mouth kind of ends up being, but this I guess doesn't look too bad. Like it does kind of look like a bird. Here's another example, a random stroke where it draws the eye. You don't like that too much, so you decide to draw the eye yourself. It takes you a while to figure out where to draw the eye. The head, the model is drawing the beak, the rest of the body, which is kind of nice. And you can see that it stitches, in a lot of cases, it stitches it well together, right? It keeps the continuity every so often, not always. And so here, I think those were the wings. I didn't like them, so I decided to draw them myself. It usually does a reasonable job of adding the legs towards the bottom attached to the body. And I think this is me now trying to finish or add the body. I missed a little bit what happened there. And so this is nice in that it ends up being just inherently sort of a collaborative setting, right? Where because it's a part-based model, either you can draw the part or the model draws the part. And regardless of that, the next part that the model decides to do will adapt to what you drew, right? Because it's looking at the sketch so far and then deciding what to do next. So the fact that you interfered at one point doesn't sort of throw it off base. It can still take over from the next step. And so there ends up being this sort of nice back and forth. So this is the bird collaboratively drawn. I was curious where it would draw the tail, so I did do it, but I forgot to record it. But if you're curious like me, then this is where it ended up drawing the trail, and so that's the rest of the sketch. So any questions on this?
Is there an option that you can add a part that it doesn't exist in your predefined set of parts? So I think that could be maybe a reason why, in the creative creatures table that you saw, it didn't perform very well in comparison to when you had to do with the birds, for example. It was a specific kind of setup, maybe more specific than when it's more creative, and then you might have parts that they're not defined very well, or they have, it's not head or legs, it's something else that is, imaginary. And that happens very often when you, like, if it's like kids that are drawing the sketches, so it's more fuzzy. And yeah, so I was wondering if there's this option as well, or if you think about adding that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We had a longer list of parts for creatures, but you're right in that, like you said, that there are some parts that just might not even have very good names in our vocabulary. That might still be a part of creative sketches. We did have one quote unquote part that was just called other, or I think we called it details, if I remember correctly, where people could add any sort of additional information that doesn't nicely fit into these part definitions. But that's not something that we modeled in this model. And so so I think that is a limitation right now. The way the model is set up, it can only generate the parts that it knows of, that it has seen during training. And so, I think that would be a good thing to add, especially like you said, to enhance the creativity of these sketches. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
How does the model handle discontinuous strokes? Like if I would have a bunch of dots rather than actually having continuous strokes?
Yeah, so the model is, so the generation as well as the processing of the input data is all through raster images. So it's just taking, it's not a vector graphics representation. It's not a sequential representation of points. It's just an image of what that stroke looks like. And so even if it was just dots and not contiguous, it would be fine in that that's what the image would look like, and it would take that in. If it hasn't seen enough of that during training, then there might just be issues because it may not recognize what this is and what it should do with it. But in terms of the representation itself, the fact that it's not continuous would not be an issue. It would only be an issue in the sense that it might be out of distribution.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. And so I don't think I will go through all 6, but I think that's I think that's completely fine. If there are questions, please keep them coming. All right. So in this next project, we were also looking at sketches, but here we were looking at a collaborative setting across multiple people. And so we were using an interface like this where people can draw strokes of various different colors, various different thicknesses, and things like that. And you can undo the stroke. And here, as you can see on the right, there is a stroke limit. So we're keeping track of how much someone drew, and that will be relevant in a second. And so what we did was we looked at a setting where if you have this one canvas, and if I come in and draw some strokes, sort of to start a picture, to start a sketch, and then I can only contribute so much. So once I hit my limit, I can't contribute anymore. And then someone else comes in and they contribute more strokes, and we haven't communicated, we haven't said what it is that we're trying to make. I just started something, someone else is coming in and adding more, someone else then comes in and adds more, and you can have we have 30 different people who come in and contribute strokes to this canvas. And so we wanted to see what should the form of this collaboration look like, to make these pictures that get created more interesting, more creative, if you will. And so as a first step, we were just focusing on human-human collaboration in hopes that whatever we find here might inform what human-machine collaboration should look like. But this project was focused entirely on human-human collaboration. And so here's what we found. If you have 30 different people coming in, what you're seeing at each snapshot are the strokes that each person contributed. And so you're seeing how this picture is evolving as more people come in and draw. And you can in some cases where we were looking at this, we would find that some people might just kind of come in and do some scribbling, and then the person that's coming in after that is trying to clean that up, either drawing over it or trying to give that some form to convert it into something that makes sense for the scene. It's also fun to look at how the story evolves. Of like when you first start looking at this, you might think this picture is going somewhere, but then as people keep adding strokes, you realize that the story maybe takes a different form. And so that's what collaborative looks like. And then we can also have an individual setting where just one person is drawing the entire picture. So is contributing 30 times whatever that stroke limit was. So it's not 30 different people. And so what you can see here is it's interesting in that you see some high quality pictures. For example, this one here, this one, or this one. And again, this is subjective, but this is just in my assessment. But then you also see that's another nice one. And then you see some not so great ones, right? Like this one here, this one here, this one here, maybe this one here is not quite as sophisticated. Maybe they look more like children's drawings. Yeah. And so in this individual setting, what you find is that it tends to be sensitive to the skills and sort of the motivation levels of the individuals, right? And instead, if you look at the pictures that we get in the collaborative setting, this is what we get, right? So it's qualitatively very different from what any one individual makes. But it still tends to be somewhat sensitive to the skill and motivation of individuals, because any one person can come in and kind of scribble all over the place, and things like that. And so what we experimented with next was having this collaborative setting, but with a voting mechanism where for every incomplete sketch that we're looking for more strokes on, we have 5 different people add strokes to that, which means we have 5 versions of what the next phase of this sketch should look like. And then everyone is shown these 5 sketches as options to decide which one they want to add to next, right? And the idea is that whichever version of the sketch is the first to be picked 5 times by other people to want to add strokes to it, that is the version that moves forward, right? So that can be a little confusing. So let me talk about it in the context of this picture. So these are 5 versions of the same sketch. You see that they have many elements in common, but there are some differences in the strokes. And then all of these were shown as options to people in terms of which sketch do you want to add more strokes to. And this one, I hope you can see my cursor, but the one on the left got picked 3 times. So 3 people decided to add strokes to that. 2 people decided to add strokes to this one. 5 people decided to add strokes to this one. 2 people for this one and 2 people for this one. And so since this is the one that was the first to get picked 5 times, we decide that this is a good sketch, and that's going to be the next version. And these are the 5 children, if you will, that become the 5 options that we can show people, right? So now we show people these 5 options and we ask them, do you want to add to this one or this one or this one? And this is the one that got picked 5 times first. And so that is the next version of the stroke, of the sketch, and that keeps going. I hope that made sense. Let me keep going, and then I can pause for questions. And so if we do that, this is what we get. So this is much more expensive to do because it can be it would be at least 5x more expensive, but it can be much more than that. And so we only had 20 people contributing to this instead of 30. So it's not quite directly comparable, but hopefully you can still get a sense. So this again is what individuals make. This is what you get if it's just completely collaborative without any voting mechanism. And this is what you get if you have this voting mechanism in there. So on the left, I feel like there's variance in quality, and even the ones that are high quality could be somewhat boring in the sense of it's kind of predictable in terms of like a house or a bird and things like that people might draw. This one is much more interesting, but it's sort of maybe a little too chaotic, a little too noisy. And then on the right is where it's still interesting compared to the individual ones, but it's maybe more coherent and more rich. So let me pause here to take, we have some quantitative evaluation with human studies that I'll get to next, but let me pause here to see if there are any questions.
I think it is very interesting that we see this sort of pattern, and it is something that we also see in, for instance, quantifying aesthetics, that there is an optima or sweet spot in how much clutter you want to, or complexity you want to add to your canvas. So it seems that the last one, the one on the right side, has a good amount of everything respect to the other two.
Yeah. And I think this is also interesting just from a, like even outside the context of sketches, but just from a collaboration perspective, that if you're thinking about what is the right way of having sort of a team of people work together to produce the best things that they can produce, there's obviously a lot of studies in that. But yeah, it's interesting to think about that as well. All right. And so this is the quantitative evaluation where, similar to what I showed earlier, this was a pairwise comparison where we asked people which sketch they prefer when you're shown 2 sketches along various dimensions, like which one is more unusual, which one seems better, which one is more creative, interesting, original, and so on. And so this is too many to look at, and I'm now trying to remember what look was. It was, I think, which one looks better, but then I'm confused between this. So yeah, I should go back and check on that. But it was, both of these are some notion of quality. This is a notion of unusualness, and then this is a notion of creative. And there was another setting that we had experimented with that I haven't told you about, so I'll cut that out from here. And so this is the result that I'd like to discuss a little bit more. And so what we're seeing here is, in terms of, and on the y-axis again is the percentage of time that kind of sketch was preferred. So higher is better. And so what we're seeing with individual sketches is that in terms of these quality measures, which one looks better, there is quite a bit of variance, which we saw. And in terms of how unusual they are, they don't tend to score very highly, right? And so we also saw that earlier, that they seem to be sort of a little sort of expected or boring, if you will. And overall, the creativity is rated what you see here. For the collaborative setting, you see that the unusualness is quite high, which we also saw qualitatively. But the quality is not very good, right? They often look a little too chaotic and too noisy and a bit all over the place. And overall, the creativity is rated here. And then if you look at the collaborative plus voting setting, the unusualness is lower than with the collaborative setting alone. So it's less crazy, if you will, but it's still higher than the individual setting. but the quality is quite high. It's lower in variance and individual, and even higher in sort of the median than the individual ones. And overall, the creativity is rated the highest. And so this is something that we've actually encountered multiple times in various projects, and we also use it as a basis of evaluation. It's also the definition of creativity on Wikipedia, and you'll find this in many other computational creativity literature and so on, that creativity is often thought of as a combination of novelty and value, that it's sort of creativity is the process of creating something new that is valuable. Just one or the other may not be enough. Just new could be something just random, but if it doesn't have any value, then that might not be very useful. And again, if it's just value, if it's just quality, then you might be just sort of reproducing something that already exists. And so if there isn't novelty in it, you wouldn't rate it well for creativity. And so we're seeing that pan out here in these studies that you see here. Any questions on this? All right. So this one is a quick one where we had done this project on taking in as input the description that you might provide of your day, of how your day went, what you were feeling about various things. And we use certain NLP techniques to extract which topics you were talking about and what emotions you described relative to those topics. And then we have this just a hand mapping, this isn't learned, a hand mapping from topics to shapes and from emotions to colors. And then we use those shapes and we use those colors in various different abstract visualizations. There's a whole series of them. You're seeing just one here. And we create these visual depictions of your day. So you can think of this sort of as an affective visual journal, if you will. And we also have a demo of this. If you want to try it out, you can take a look. This next project is on, it changes domains a bit. So this we're looking at taking in as input a piece of music and producing a dance, if you will. And the reason dance is in quotes is because it essentially is just a sequence of movements that sync with the music. We're not bringing in any domain knowledge of what good dance looks like or what choreography, like what choreographers would talk about and things like that. It's just a sequence of movements that we're trying to produce that may give you the sense of a dance. And so the way this was set up was we have as input this piece of music. We can represent this with this self-similarity matrix, where at every location is every cell in this matrix is telling us how similar the music is at those 2 points in time. So every cell ij is checking how similar it was the music at time step I with the music at time step j. And then we have this agent that is a very simple, but it's a fairly general agent where all it can do is it can take one of k different states. And so over time, it can transition at any point in time. It can either choose to stay at the same state or go up a state or go down a state. And so over time, it can take the sequence of states that you're seeing here. And so any sequence of these states is one candidate movement. And so this movement can also be characterized with the cell similarity matrix, where at cell ij, you're looking at how similar was this movement at those 2 points in time. Now, the similarity can be in terms of how similar the states were, so how close the states were, or it could be in terms of how similar was the action that was taken at those points in time, or it can be a combination of both. And we experiment with all three in the paper that you're welcome to check out. And so now we have this music, we have a candidate movement. We compare these two matrices just through sort of a linear correlation to see how well they match, right? And for each candidate movement, we'll get this different matrix, and we can search through this space till we find a movement whose self-similarity matrix matches the music self-similarity matrix as much as possible, right? And so once we find the movement with the highest self-similarity, that is the movement that we choose as our output movement. And what this essentially captures is that whenever the music was similar at 2 points in time, the movement will be similar in those 2 points in time as well. And our hypothesis was that this will make the movement seem synced, right? And so to take a step back, the kind of the high level curiosity or the high level question here was, can we produce movements that look like dance without using any paired data, without using any examples of what dance looks like, and just by enforcing these basic notions like I described here, that whenever the music is similar, the movement should be similar. And if that's all we capture, what does this movement look like? Does it look like dance to us? And so on. The interesting thing here is that once you have this movement that you've decided, the sequence of states that you've decided is your final dance, you now have a lot of flexibility in how to visualize this dance, right? So because the agent is just picking one of K states, you can visualize the dance through any sequence of K visuals, right? So for example, you can have, if there are K states, you could have a set of K human poses that vary in some smooth fashion from 1 through K. And then whichever state the agent had picked, you pick that pose as your visualization, right? So you'll be traversing through these K poses as dictated by the sequence of states that your movement had. It can also be a sequence of these abstract geometric patterns, right? K abstract geometric patterns. Or it could be frames from an actual video, or it could be photos that you may have taken. It can be anything really. And I think there's a lot of interesting things to explore there. And so, yeah, so to give you an example, here's a very simple visualization, right? We can just visualize the states as on this 1D, on this x-axis. And I'm going to play this. Hopefully you can hear it, and hopefully it won't be too loud. Let me know if anything seems off. So this is, I mean, depending on how, like, this might seem a bit crazy and weird, but it might also seem intriguing. I fall in the latter camp, obviously, but let me play a few more, and some of it might be a bit jarring, but just bear with me. Oops. So here the state is converted to the size of this disk as opposed to the location of the disk, but the underlying algorithm is the same. The only thing we're changing is the visualization, right? I can't tell you what it really is. I can only tell you what it feels like. And right now it's a steel knife in my windpipe. All right. Here's another one. And so it also, as you can see, it doesn't matter what the music is like, right? It's doing this very basic thing of saying whenever the music is similar, the movement should be similar. And so it can work with a wide variety of things. Here's another one. All right, I think you get the idea. I'll skip this last one here because it seems like a bit much. But if you thought this was fun, you can check out more at the URL that you're seeing on these slides. All right. And so we did some human studies. We asked people, we showed them two movements, and we asked them which one seems to be going with the music better. So you can think of this as value. We asked them which one is more predictable, and so that's low on novelty. Less predictable would be high. Which one seems more creative? Which one is more inspiring? We compare it to an agent that's just going left to right, but in sync with the beat, which means it'll be high value. It will go well with the music, but it will be very predictable. So it'll probably be low novelty. We compare it to an agent that's just moving randomly. And so that'll be high novelty. It won't be very predictable, but it'll also be low value because it's just ignoring the music. We can compare it to an agent that's moving randomly, but in sync with the beat. So this one is a stronger baseline. It has decent novelty, and it'll have decent value. And then there's our approach. And we do find in our human studies that this was rated as more creative. And this is broken down in much more detail in the paper that you're welcome to check out. All right. And then we also have a demo where you can try this out with different pieces of music to see the different visualizations. All right. So any questions on this? Hopefully this wasn't too bizarre.
I don't have any questions. It's just really cool. I did think it was very interesting.
Thank you. I think so too, but I always worry that it might just seem off to other people. So thank you for saying that.
I also liked it a lot because I think, you know, the value that you were defining here is also interesting because, for instance, we know that in some sort of art and design, well, specifically in design, design means making sense of things. And that is how the value is defined. And I think in this case, also making sense of things is a way of defining the value. For instance, it does make sense that this music goes with this sort of pattern.
Interesting.
Because, when one wants to quantify these things, it is always a question of how do we define it, how do we measure it. So I like how you actually you were brave and took these two measures. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right, so I know we only have 8 more minutes, so I'll go through the rest fairly quickly. So this next one was on thematic typography. So you sort of see this at many different places, right, where you're trying to reinforce certain message through the choice of typography that you're using. And we wanted to see if we can automate that. And so the setup was, as you're given as input a word like exam and a theme like education. And what you want to produce is something like this, where you're writing out the word exam, because that was the input, by using icons that come from the theme education. But obviously you need these icons to look like the individual letters so that the word is actually legible. And so I won't go into the approach of how we do this. It's fairly straightforward. It's what you might expect, where we have representation for fonts and for letters in various fonts, and we have representations from these icons from the Noun project, which actually has many, many icons. If anyone's not familiar with it, it's a very nice resource. And we try and essentially reason about similarity and replace letters with icons of various themes. And so these are example outputs. If our approach is given as input the word book and the theme library, it produces this. For car and the theme driving, roads and signs, it produces this. For the theme witch and for the word witch and the theme Halloween, it produces this. The word play and the theme Olympics, it produces this. And you can play with this if you want at this URL. And so we had some human studies for whether people can actually read the word from our output, if they can actually tell what the theme is from our output. And there's some interesting strong baselines that you can set up that optimizes for one or the other. And we find that ours kind of has the sweet spot in there. But yeah. And in this last one, we were looking at neurosymbolic generative art. And so and the motivation was sort of in one sort of group of generative artists, they're looking at neural generation, right? They're looking at models like GANs, and through this interpolation, they're trying to search through the space to find something that looks interesting. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are looking more at procedural generation of visual patterns. And so it's sort of more of a symbolic approach, if you will, and you're very explicitly varying certain parameters. It's still a generative process because there is randomness to this. There's a random seed that affects various choices, where you can experiment with different color palettes and things like that, like you see here, right? And so here again, you're searching through the parameter space till you find something you like. And we were curious whether there could be sort of a mix of these two in some way. And so what we did here is, again, nothing too terribly surprising, but we have this symbolic generator where you can just automatically now generate a whole bunch of data, right? Because you can just vary these parameters automatically and get your generations. And then we can use this as training data to train a neural generator, so something like a GAN, and have generations from that, right? And so now you can explore this space through interpolations. And what's interesting is, and so this is what the neurosymbolic generator would look like. You can search through these interpolations to get different images, to get different generations. And what was interesting to us here was what the aesthetic looks like when there is sort of the crispness of these symbolic approaches, of these procedural generations, and then there is a very peculiar aesthetic associated with neural generations. And we were curious to see what the intersection of that looks like. And so we built this interface. You're welcome to try it out at this URL. And again, we ran some human studies that I won't get into the details of, but people did like the neurosymbolic approach quite a bit over the symbolic ones. And again, we have this breakdown that we see here. Maybe I will take a second because we've talked about it. So here is, we're comparing neurosymbolic to symbolic alone. And the different axes are which one looks better, which one is more unusual, which one is more creative, and which process, if they're actually not just looking at the final artifact, but if they're actually playing with the interface, which one is more satisfying. And so what we're finding here is that this is right around 50%. So both neurosymbolic and symbolic are equally good, and you can think of this as value. The neurosymbolic process is more unusual. And so you can think of that as being more novel, and that's also the one that gets rated as more creative. Interestingly, the symbolic approach was more satisfying. So I think this crispness, there's something to investigate there. We haven't looked into that more. But all right, so that was all the 6 things that I wanted to talk to you about. I'll just summarize by saying creativity is at the core of all progress we make. And so in that sense, this is sort of a very important and impactful space to be looking in. Expressing ourselves creatively is a deeply human experience. And so if we can find ways for AI to impact either of these 2 things, I think that's a very powerful use of technology. One theme that you may have seen over and over is that a lot of the evaluation that we've done tends to take this form of creativity as a combination of novelty and value. And we found this to be a useful breakdown to look at things. And so, yeah, using AI is interesting because it's interesting AI challenges, puts human AI collaboration at the center of it. And like I said, I think it can be a fairly powerful use of technology. So with that, I'll stop and take any more questions that we might have in the last 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting and intriguing, especially that we see this sort of visual dialogue between human and machine. And I think this is very inspiring to do research in this area.
Thank you.
Are there questions?
I have a couple of questions, actually. Thanks so much for such an interesting talk. It was really interesting to see all of those things together and separately. I have a couple of questions. One of them is about the neurosymbolic work that you shared. And I was wondering if you think one of the reasons that it might be less satisfying to interact with has to do with the fact that you're sort of abandoning the symbolic control after a point, and then it becomes totally neural, and you can't really reason about the neural output the way that you can about the symbolic generation. And if you think that sampling from the latent space in some kind of principled manner, or maybe learning constraints for the sampling or something like that, might be a way of really integrating those, and whether that would kind of yield some of the crispness where you can actually reason about the processes that are involved in.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think that's a great hypothesis. There has been a lot of work, as I'm sure you're aware of, trying to map these latent spaces to more interpretable. I think David Bao, you said, gave a talk here, right? So he probably talked about this quite a bit. And so, yeah, I think looking at something like that, where if it's still the neural, like you said, eventually the controls are entirely neural, but if they've been mapped to things that are more semantic, and as a result, there is more interpretable control for the user, does that make it more satisfying? I think that's a great hypothesis to test out. The other counter could be that maybe it's not so much about the interpretable control, it's just something about the crispness of the final artifact. Right. The fact that the symbolic artifact is just crisp and clean. Is that what is more satisfying? And right now they're both entangled, like we don't know. So I think that's a great one to tease apart.
Really interesting. And another question I had was actually about the evaluation framework. And I think the novelty plus value, of course, I'm familiar with that, the Margaret Boden novelty surprise value. And but I was wondering if you think it's worth, it seems like we're making progress on reaching the sort of out of distribution goals. And I'm thinking of like OpenAI DALL-E recently, and stuff where it really seems like things are starting to be really crisp outside the distribution. And as we start to kind of push further, it feels like when humans make things that are so far outside the distribution, the value of them is way more localized in the population. Like it's not something that sort of pervades the general consciousness. And so if you were to run like an MTurk study with something that a human created that was really bizarre or novel, it seems unlikely that it would actually be rated as being more valuable. But if you were to run it on a specific population who has some sort of priors for valuing that type of work, they might think that it's really valuable. And I'm wondering whether you think that evaluating the creativity of artificial systems can sort of be more rigorous in that way as we start to push further and further, try to get more localized concepts of value and try to go beyond sort of just being believable, but actually being more valuable to specific people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I do think this space really needs more progress in terms of the evaluation being more rigorous. Right now, I feel like everyone does their own thing. And I mean, intuitively, it makes sense. They're often reasonable choices, but it makes it very difficult to track progress as a field, right? As a community, it's very hard to know whether we are better off right now than we were 5 years ago, for instance, right? There's no standard benchmarks or metrics. A lot of the stuff that the machine learning community does well, I think is missing here. I think it's missing for good reason, and that it's not easy to do it here. So I'm not trying to say that we're just not getting our act together. I do think it's hard to do it. But I think pushing for that more would be great. To your earlier point of this assessment of value being more local, I think I completely agree, right? Depending on who is evaluating this, the assessment of value will change, how they've been trained, even what just their life experiences are, right? Even if it's not specific training. And the same person might evaluate the value differently at different points in time. And I think another important thing here is that this notion of value out of context might also be weird, right? It might be value to do what, right? Is this something that I'm trying to sell? Is this something I'm trying to put up in my house? Is this something I'm trying to use to be inspired myself to make something different? So I think having some sort of an end goal or an end task would also ground this notion of value much better. And one way of, and oh wow, we are completely out of time. So I was going to say something more, but I think I will stop here, and I'm happy to continue this conversation offline.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a very intriguing conversation. In fact, thank you so much for all of these thoughts and giving this talk.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for all the questions along the way.